On the 25th of July, 1943, the man who had ruled Italy for 21 years vanished. Benito Mussolini, Illinois Duce, the founder of fascism, the ally Adolf Hitler trusted above all others, was arrested on the orders of his own king. He had gone to the royal palace expecting a routine audience. Instead, he was bundled into an ambulance and driven away under guard. To the outside world, it looked as though fascism in Italy had simply ceased to exist overnight. But for Adolf Hitler, sitting in his headquarters in East Prussia, the news landed like a betrayal from within his own family. Mussolini was not just a political partner. He was, in Hitler's mind, the man who had stood beside him since the earliest days of the movement, the one dictator in Europe he considered a genuine friend. And now the Italians, his own allies, had thrown him in a cell and were quietly negotiating peace with the Americans and the British behind Germany's back. Hitler's response was immediate and absolute. Mussolini would be found. He would be freed. And he would be brought back alive, whatever the cost. This order set into motion one of the strangest and most audacious special operations of the entire war, a mission that would come to be known as Unternehmen Eiche, Operation Oak. The problem was simple to state and monstrously difficult to solve. Nobody in Berlin knew where Mussolini actually was. The new Italian government, led by Marshal Pietro Badoglio, understood exactly how valuable their prisoner had become. Mussolini was moved constantly, from island to island, from villa to fortress, always one step ahead of German intelligence. He was held on the island of Ponza, then transferred to La Maddalena off Sardinia, each location more isolated than the last. German agents chased rumors across the Mediterranean for weeks, following false leads, intercepting fragments of radio traffic, piecing together a picture that kept dissolving the moment they thought they had it. Hitler assigned the search to a small, almost improvised team, built around two very different men. The first was General Kurt Student, the father of Germany's airborne forces, a meticulous planner who had led the costly but successful invasion of Crete by parachute 2 years earlier. The second man was far less known, an Austrian-born SS officer named Otto Skorzeny, a giant of a man with a dueling scar across his cheek, an engineer by training who had talked his way into commando work through sheer persistence and audacity. Skorzeny had never led a mission of this scale before. He had spent the war so far in relatively minor sabotage and reconnaissance roles. But Hitler wanted someone outside the traditional military hierarchy, someone whose loyalty was to the Führer personally rather than to the general staff, and Skorzeny fit that requirement perfectly. Together, Student and Skorzeny began assembling a rescue force from whatever men and aircraft could be spared from an already overstretched war machine. Time was the enemy from the very beginning. Every day that passed increased the risk that Italy would formally surrender, hand Mussolini over to the Allies, or simply have him quietly killed to remove the problem entirely. And then, in early September, a breakthrough. Italian radio intercepts and a captured document suggested Mussolini had been moved once more, this time to the Italian mainland itself, to a location so remote and so seemingly secure that his captors apparently believed no rescue was even conceivable. The Gran Sasso. The Gran Sasso is the highest peak in the Apennine mountain range, a jagged wall of limestone rising more than 9,000 feet above the Italian countryside. Near its summit sat the Campo Imperatore, a hotel built a few years earlier as a ski resort for wealthy Italian tourists, now repurposed as the most inaccessible prison in Europe. The only way up was a single cable car line, easily guarded, easily destroyed if an approach was detected. The terrain around the hotel was a plateau of jagged rock, sloped and uneven, surrounded on every side by cliffs and ravines that made any conventional ground assault effectively impossible. Whoever chose this location for Mussolini's confinement had clearly assumed that isolation itself was a form of security. You cannot storm a mountain. You cannot march an infantry column up a sheer rock face while 150 armed carabinieri wait at the top with a clear line of sight in every direction. Reaching the summit by land would take hours, if it was possible at all, and would sacrifice every advantage of surprise. Student and Skorzeny studied aerial photographs of the plateau for days, and a single, almost reckless idea began to take shape. If the ground could not be crossed, then the mountain would have to be attacked from above, not by parachute, which would scatter men across miles of broken terrain, but by glider. Silent aircraft, towed most of the way and then released to descend without engine noise, could in theory put a small force directly onto the plateau beside the hotel itself, achieving total surprise in the last critical seconds before contact. It was an extraordinary gamble. Gliders of that era were unpowered wooden and canvas aircraft, difficult to control with precision, entirely dependent on wind and a pilot's skill to land safely in an open field, let alone on a rock-strewn mountaintop shelf barely large enough to take the impact. If the landing failed, if a single glider clipped the cliff edge or came down too hard on the uneven ground, the men inside would likely be killed before they ever reached the hotel doors. And even if the landing succeeded, roughly 90 German commandos would be facing a garrison more than 100 strong, in a defensive position, with no possibility of reinforcement and no line of retreat except the very aircraft that had just crash-landed around them. Student had reservations. He worried the plan asked too much of inexperienced glider pilots and gave the defenders every opportunity to simply open fire the moment the gliders appeared over the ridge, killing Mussolini in the crossfire before he could ever be freed. But there was no better alternative on the table, and the clock was running out. Hitler wanted his friend rescued, and he wanted it done now, not after weeks of further planning. On the 12th of September, 1943, the operation was set into motion. 12 gliders, each carrying a small squad of German paratroopers and SS commandos, took off from an airfield near Rome, towed behind Henschel aircraft toward the mountain that had, until that morning, seemed completely untouchable. Alongside the raiders sat a man neither Scorzani nor Student had fully wanted along for the mission, an Italian general named Fernando Soliti, brought as a hostage of sorts, someone who could shout down to the Italian guards below and hopefully prevent them from opening fire the instant German uniforms appeared out of the sky. As the gliders approached the plateau, engines cut, and the aircraft began their silent, terrifying descent toward a landing zone that from the air looked barely larger than the wingspan of the gliders themselves. The descent took only minutes, but for the men crammed inside those wooden frames, it must have felt like the longest few minutes of the war. Below them, the plateau came into focus, rockier and smaller than any of them had hoped, sloping unevenly toward the cliff edge with no clear runway, no flat stretch of grass, nothing but broken stone and the looming shape of the Campo Imperatore Hotel itself. There was no possibility of a controlled, gentle touchdown. The pilots did the only thing they could. They aimed for the slope near the building and let the gliders skid to a stop however the ground allowed, wings tearing off, undercarriages splintering, men thrown forward against their restraints as wood and canvas ground against rock. Several gliders were damaged badly enough on landing that they never flew again, and a number of men were injured before a single shot had been fired. But astonishingly, most of the raiders walked away from the crashes able to fight, and Scorzani's glider came down almost directly beside the hotel, closer to the objective than anyone had dared to plan. What happened in the next few minutes has become one of the most retold moments of the entire war, precisely because of how little actually happened. Scorzani and his men scrambled out of the wreckage and rushed the building before the Italian guards had fully processed what was happening above their heads. General Soliti, the Italian officer brought along specifically for this purpose, shouted down to the carabinieri manning the perimeter, ordering them not to fire. Whether it was the shock of gliders appearing silently out of the sky, the sight of one of their own generals commanding them to stand down, or simply the sheer disorientation of an attack nobody had believed was physically possible, the Italian garrison hesitated. And in war, hesitation of even a few seconds can decide everything. Scorzani himself sprinted past the confused guards and into the hotel, moving with a speed and confidence that left the defenders no time to organize any coherent resistance. He found Mussolini inside within minutes, reportedly saying only a brief line to reassure him that he had come on the Führer's orders to set him free. Not a single defender fired a shot with intent to kill during the entire assault. There are conflicting accounts of a stray shot or two in the general confusion, but no meaningful firefight ever developed. A raid that both Student and Scorzani had feared might turn into a bloodbath on a mountainside, with Mussolini caught in the crossfire, instead ended in almost complete silence, the entire hotel garrison surrendering within a quarter of an hour of the first glider touching down. It remains one of the most remarkable outcomes of any commando raid in modern military history, 90 men overwhelming a fortified position of more than 150 without a single fatal exchange of fire. But taking the hotel was only half the problem the Germans now faced. They were standing on top of a mountain with no working gliders left capable of flight, no roads, and an increasingly nervous prisoner who needed to be gotten off that summit and back to German-controlled territory before Italian reinforcements or Allied aircraft could intervene. Getting up the mountain had been dangerous. Getting down again, with Mussolini in tow, would prove almost as perilous, and in some ways stranger still. The original plan called for Mussolini to be walked down to the cable car station and driven away by road once at the base of the mountain. But somewhere in the chaos of the moment, whether from Scorzani's own instinct for dramatic improvisation or from a genuine assessment of the risk still posed by Italian forces in the surrounding valleys, a far bolder idea took hold. A small, fragile Fieseler Storch observation aircraft, capable of taking off and landing in an extraordinarily short distance, had been flown up separately and was waiting near the hotel. The Storch was designed to carry a pilot and perhaps one passenger, certainly not built for the mountain's thin air, its short and uneven ground, nor for the additional weight Skorzeny now intended to put into it. Skorzeny made the decision to fly out with Mussolini himself, climbing into the tiny aircraft alongside the pilot, Captain Heinrich Gerlach, and the free Duce, 3 men crammed into a machine meant for 2, on a strip of rocky ground far shorter than any manual would recommend for takeoff, with a sheer drop at the end of it. Gerlach reportedly protested that the added weight made a safe takeoff nearly impossible on that terrain. Skorzeny insisted regardless, unwilling to leave the outcome of the entire mission to a slower and potentially more exposed road journey down the mountain. The little plane rattled forward across the broken ground, gathering speed far too slowly for comfort, the cliff edge rushing closer with every second, until at what felt like the final possible moment it lifted off the plateau and dropped away from the mountain's edge, dipping alarmingly toward the valley floor before the pilot wrestled it back under control and turned toward Rome. It was, by any reasonable measure of aviation safety, a reckless gamble stacked on top of an already reckless mission. And yet it worked. Word of the rescue spread within hours, first through German military channels and then across international radio broadcasts. Adolf Hitler, informed almost immediately, expressed something close to open relief and pride, treating the raid as vindication of his instinct to risk men and resources on what many of his own generals had privately considered a near-impossible fantasy. Mussolini was flown onward to Vienna, then to Munich, and finally to a meeting with Hitler himself in East Prussia, reunited with the ally he had helped bring to power and who had now, in turn, pulled him out of what would almost certainly have become permanent Allied custody. Otto Skorzeny became an overnight legend, celebrated across Germany as the commando who had pulled off the impossible, a reputation that would follow him for the rest of his life and shape the mythology of special forces operations for decades to come. But the story that followed Mussolini's rescue was, in its own way, a far darker epilogue than the daring raid itself. Mussolini did not return to Italy as a triumphant ruler restored to his throne. He returned as a man entirely dependent on German protection, propped up as the nominal head of a puppet state in the north of the country, the so-called Italian Social Republic, based at Salo on the shores of Lake Garda. He had lost his army, his territory, and much of his authority, presiding now over a fragment of the country his fascist movement had once ruled outright, a figurehead kept in place largely because Hitler still found some political use in maintaining the appearance of a functioning fascist Italy. The daring rescue that had made headlines around the world had, in the end, purchased Mussolini less than 2 more years of a diminished, increasingly hollow existence, one that would conclude in April of 1945 with his capture and execution by Italian partisans as the war finally collapsed around him. For Otto Skorzeny, the Gran Sasso raid became the foundation of an entire wartime reputation, and he would go on to lead other high-profile operations for Hitler, though none would ever quite match the audacity or the clean, near-bloodless success of that first mission on the mountain. Historians have debated for decades exactly how much credit belongs to Skorzeny personally versus the broader planning effort led by General Student and the paratroop units who did much of the difficult work of actually landing safely and securing the plateau. Skorzeny's own post-war accounts, often self-promoting and occasionally contradicted by other participants, have made it difficult to separate the historical record from the legend he cultivated around himself in the years that followed. What remains beyond dispute is the sheer improbability of what was attempted and achieved on that mountaintop, a raid built on incomplete intelligence, unproven tactics, damaged aircraft, and a prisoner rescue carried out in full view of more than 100 armed guards, resolved almost entirely through speed, audacity, and the psychological shock of the impossible suddenly arriving out of a clear September sky. Operation Oak endures as one of the defining special operations of the Second World War, not because of its strategic consequences, which turned out to be relatively modest, but because of how starkly it demonstrated what a small, determined force could accomplish when conventional wisdom insisted the objective simply could not be reached. Mussolini's rescue changed little about the ultimate trajectory of the war. Germany's fortunes continued to decline on every front in the months that followed, and the fascist state Skorzeny had worked so hard to preserve collapsed less than 2 years later regardless. But for one extraordinary afternoon on the highest peak in the Apennines, a handful of gliders, a fragile observation plane, and the sheer audacity of the men involved rewrote what anyone believed was possible in modern warfare, a mission remembered not for what it changed, but for how impossibly close it came to never working at all.